in being humble, which is a very important aspect of Judaism, to be humble, but at the same time to be great. And I think it's a fascinating topic, something we should be looking at, and it's certainly a lesson from the Meraglim, from the spies that we read about in this week's Parsha. I just want you to picture this for a moment. Have you ever been on a flight? You're on a long international flight or something, and there's a baby crying, keeping everybody awake. As a proud father of 7 little kids living far away from my family, I could say that's been me and my kid, my family more than once. But the question I wonder is, have you ever said to yourself, what does this child think they're doing, right? Doesn't the kid realize I need to sleep tonight? What's going on here? Inconsiderate, right? What's going on? Now, of course, you don't think that way, even though you might be heading to a very important meeting or to a wedding or whatever it is, right? Because you understand that the baby lacks that self-awareness. The baby can't be blamed for making this public scene, for crying, for keeping you awake throughout the flight. And of course, if it wasn't a baby, if it was an adult, how would we react then? I think we would be a little bit less pleased to see an adult behaving in that way. And if it was an adult making those noises at night, I think we would tell them. I mean, just a few minutes ago here, before this year began, I made this announcement. I don't know why I have to make that announcement often. If you keep your radio or TV on in the background there, first of all, I don't know how you can listen to me. But besides the point, you're disturbing everybody else in here. This is like a flight. So we're all getting distracted in this moment, and one should be considerate to that. And, that's why I clicked the mute button, because if you don't mute yourself, I'll mute you. But just so you know, you could unmute yourself at any point. If you have a question, if you have something you want to mention, if you want to discuss something, just if you are unmuting yourself, make sure that background noise is muted. We shouldn't hear your TV blaring in the background. The point is, we're adults. We should know better. And that is a little bit about self-awareness. And that's something I want to talk about today. Self-awareness, what has it got to do with the Parsha? Well, you'll see in a moment, because in fact, this is a topic it's an ongoing topic I was reading by scientists and psychologists. To this day, this is something they discuss. Studies have been performed on animals, on elephants, on dolphins, and I think even plants, to determine whether or not they have some semblance of self, right? I remember when I first went to Kruger Park, and I remember who drove me. It was Howard Uter. This is nearly 20 years ago. 19 years ago, I came here as a yeshiva student. I arrived in South Africa, and we were treated out to a trip to Kruger Park one day. Well, we had to pay a little bit, whatever it was. And my driver was Howard Hillel Uter. Some of you might know him from Pretoria. And Howard was telling us about that they once had fences. Kruger Park spans 3 countries. I don't know my geography here very well, but I think it's Botswana, South Africa, and is it Zambia or is it Zimbabwe? Whichever one it is. Someone wants to correct me, just so I'm not saying that's something that's factually incorrect. But what I was told was that they used to have fences, and the elephants would go until the fence, and then they would come back. And then eventually they took the fences down, but the elephants still didn't go beyond those fences. Very interesting that they had that type of awareness. But there are studies being performed, but that's not really the topic of our discussion today. I want to focus on one aspect of self-awareness. That's our identity, our self-definition. And that's a very important aspect. How do we perceive ourselves? Animals don't have identity crises, right? That's a very human condition. We're very aware that others perceive us in certain ways. And that, of course, gets us asking questions about ourselves, right? We ask ourselves. We start thinking at some age and stage in our life. Oftentimes it's in adolescence, and other times and periods in life too. Who are we, right? What difference do we make? Somebody once told me that when we are kids or teens, where we think everybody's looking at us and everybody cares what we're doing, and it makes such a difference how we're dressed and how we look and how put together we are and what we, and then eventually we realize that, that's not exactly how it is, but I'm forgetting the expression, so I won't make mockery of that. Whatever the case is, the point is sometimes we become self-aware. And that's why the truth is that teenage and college age years are so vital, because it's when we start defining what's right and wrong, asking those big questions of life. And sadly today, I think there are terrible influences out there, why we see many college age students becoming very left-leaning, opposition to Israel, get onto the wrong side of the cause. It's a very impressionable age. And
egocentric.
Pardon?
Egocentric.
Yes. Well, that's part of it. I'm not only talking about the narcissism and egoism, which is also part of it, but just generally, we're not talking about the wrong side. Because I think egocentric that you're mentioning, Rosalind, could have a negative connotation to it, because one is then becoming, like you said, egocentric. When one is egocentric, that could be quite problematic, because their focus is just on themselves. I'm talking here a little bit about a self-awareness.
Sorry, just children till the age of 7.
There's a lack of self-awareness then, right?
Right.
With children, but
yes.
But ourselves, when we are, the truth is, I believe this awareness is throughout our life, and especially the question we ask ourselves: what difference do I make? You ever have an identity crisis? The people at some point in their life, I haven't reached midlife yet. I'm still 18, right? I haven't hit that midlife crisis, but I'm 18, hitting 40. And the question is, at what stage people have that kind of identity crisis? Who am I really? That story they tell about the guy who wasn't, he wasn't sure about who he was, and he was afraid he would get lost. So one day he had a little red string. It's a Chelmite story. Could have happened, right? He has a little red string made and he puts around his toe. And one day he goes to the bathhouse and the red string from his toe winds up on someone else's toe. So he turns to the guy and says, I know who you are, but perhaps you could tell me, who am I? A lot of people are on that journey of self-discovery. Who am I? And people, why do you think therapists are in business? And people go to all types of gurus and even rabbis, and you have life coaches today. And people come and trying to figure out, who am I? What's my mission in life? What am I doing here? What's it all about? So today I thought we should look into the Parsha a little bit on this particular topic, because I think it's an important topic. And in this week's Parsha, we yesterday discussed how we learn about the spies that Moshe sent to scout out the promised land and to prepare the Jewish people for the conquest of the land. So we're going to focus on one specific verse, a very curious instance of that, what do we call it? Self-definition, how one sees themselves. And that can be used as a window into the Torah's view on how we should see ourselves. And let's just look into the verses. Let's see what's going on. The curtain parts, and we find ourselves in the Sinai desert. The Jews, of course, they just escaped Egypt not long ago. They were slaves, and God emancipated us from our bondage there. And we're now a free people, a nation under God. Things are looking good. We received the Torah at Mount Sinai. We're about to enter the country that God promised, where the laws of the Torah would finally be implemented. As we discussed in detail yesterday, that many of the laws indeed were only implemented when we got to Israel. So they're finally going to realize that dream. They're going to create that dream of civilization. And it's a civilization to end idolatry and other prevailing evils of the time. And what happens? We know that didn't materialize, because when they sent the spies to scout out the land, we made a disastrous choice. I'm talking about our ancestors, But in some ways, as we learn the Parsha, it's not just the stories that happened to them, but it's relevant to each of us in our lives as well today. So if we look at that story, we wonder to ourselves, well, we made a wrong choice and everything changed. Well, you could say that in general, if you want to put that story and make it very relevant to our own lives, the land of Israel, perhaps you could say, reflects our life, our personal system, and there's Israel and there's Hamas. There's two kings who are trying to control this land of Israel. Who's going to gain control? Is it our good inclination, Israel? Is it our evil inclination, Hamas? Right? You see, and then one wonders what's the difference. And the truth is, if you study Hasidus, it gives a major analogy about how we compete compared to the land of Israel. There were 7 nations that actually occupied Israel at that time that we had to conquer. Those 7 nations represent the 7 emotions that we have that we discussed previously. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus, starting with kindness and discipline and the synthesis of them and all that. We're not going to go into those details today. And then there's the 3 intellectual faculties, our cognitive attributes, which are Chachma, Bina, Das, representing Chabad. And then there are the garments of the soul, which is our thought, speech, and action. And in order for the rest of the emotions to be in check, we have to make sure our thought, speech, and action are in the right place. Because what we see is what we do, what leads us to our actions. So it's all part of this whole process of who's going to conquer the land, the good inclination or the evil inclination. In that case, unfortunately, the Jews did not make it into Israel because they made the wrong choice and they were punished for it. They were wandering in the desert for the next 40 years so that everyone in that generation would die out and a whole new generation that would be, so to say, pristine, clean, fresh new beginners, they would enter the land. As we put it yesterday, if they couldn't adapt to the new reality, that they're not going to bask in spirituality 24/7, as seemingly was the lifestyle of the desert, then that is what they're going to miss out on. Long story short, the spies scattered out the land, and I want to pick one verse or a few verses there that stand out to me in the story, because they come back and they say, fantastic news, right? We saw everything. It was great. It was wonderful. It was fantastic. Here are samples of the fruit. And then they add one word that deletes it all. What word did they say? They said, everything is good. Ephes, but you know what happens when I tell my child how wonderful they are? As Dale Carnegie says, always begin with praise and shower a person with praise. But there's one problem. That word but, you know what it did? It just deleted everything else I said until now. The word but. Once you say it's good, but, then it's not good. Nothing's good. And now they start to heap on all the problems. We can't conquer them because there are these giants in the land, and they tell us about the enormous fruits. And the spies were just intimidated. They said it's impossible. Now, you all know by now the word impossible spells I'm possible, and therefore nothing is impossible, right? But what they said was that the Hanashim, the people there, it's impossible for us to go against them. They're stronger than us. How do you know they're stronger than us? We know that, right? And they went on and slandered the land. They gave a terrible report about the land. Everything they said was just how bad it was, right? Now, if you go on in the verses, they describe all the terrible things, how it's impossible for us to conquer that land. There are all these giants there. And we read the verse yesterday. I didn't put it into the slide today. The verse about where they said, Eretz oicheles yoshveha. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants, right? And they said, everything we saw there, these were people of great stature. There's another line that stands out to me. I don't have my verse. Let me grab my chumash. But the one that stands out to me was where they said, we were in their eyes like grasshoppers, right? So there's a few things I'm just going to put out on the table here. Number one is the way they said but. That word but deleted and undid everything that they said before. And what's interesting is that they use the word ephes, which means zero. It means but it also means zero. It's saying all the qualities we said before add up to zero because we just dismissed it all. You understand that? That's one problem. We could talk about zero just now because zero itself, we could learn from that too, because there's a positive usage of the word zero too, or but. But we know what happens. The spies were punished for the negative report. Or should I say 10 of the spies, and 2 of them, Yeshua and Caleb, do manage to enter the land. But the Jewish people as a whole, we weren't spared at the time. We listened. We know in general the laws of Lashon Hara, which we discussed in previous weeks, that the laws of Lashon Hara, of slander, are very strict. As careful as we have to be, the laws of kosher, what comes into our mouths, we have to be careful with what comes out of our mouths. In fact, we have to be careful even what we listen to. If we hear Lashon Hara being talked, we should be shutting our ears. We shouldn't be participating in the discussion. We should be ignoring it, because when we listen to gossip, the Talmud says 3 people are being affected by it. The speaker, who is speaking slanderous remarks. Now, there's different types of slanders. There's what's true, but it's not relevant to everyone else. There's what isn't true, which is even worse yet, right? Where there's fabricated stories, just libels. So, but it's not a share about Lashon Hara today. The point is, though, that even everybody was punished because everyone bought into it for the most part. The majority influenced everyone. And in general, when it comes to Lashon Hara, we say the speaker, the listener, and even the person who didn't listen, the person who was spoken about, is affected detrimentally, right? If we're talking negative about somebody, whether they're aware of it or not, they are being impacted in a negative way. And all that generation died out in the desert. None of them made it to the land of Israel. Only the next generation, those who were under the age 20 at that time, were able to go to Israel. Meaning anyone at this stage, when the negative report came in, was over age 20, died out. So yes, by the time we got to Israel, there were 60-year-olds who made it into Israel. But they were below age 20 when the negative report was given by the spies at that time. They were the new generation. They were the ones who were lucky enough to enter Israel. Now, we have to know, of course, that it's true that not all of the spies were guilty. There were the 2 righteous ones, Yeshua and Caleb, and perhaps not all of the people were guilty for listening, but it turned out that none of them were able to, except Joshua and Caleb did make it to Israel, right? Yeshua was the successor of Moshe. Now, when we just look at this story, as we discussed it, it seems like these 10 spies were a conniving bunch, and they just spoiled that mission. But as you know, that we can't put everything as that. Yes, if you look at it literally from the report, it seems that way. But if you want to go a little bit deeper, Moshe Rabbeinu agreed to send them, even though it was begrudgingly, right? Because the words in the Torah are shlach lecha. God is saying, you could send them. I'm not telling you to send them. If you trust me, the Almighty, if God took you out of Egypt and performed all the wonders and miracles and everything else for you, then certainly you should be trusting that God is going to look after you here too. And I'm not taking you into any kind of plot, but the point is, at the end of the day, their mission was to give a report on the land, and that's exactly what they did. They simply reported what they saw. Was it their fault that the facts on the ground weren't so flattering? that there were giants, that there were big fruit, that there were fortified cities, right? All that was true. So what exactly did they do wrong? Were they supposed to lie to the people and tell them, no, everything is great? That's what you do. If you're a reporter, you report on the facts. The problem we find these days with many reporters is they don't report on facts. They report on feelings. That's exactly what these spies did. They also didn't report on facts. They reported on facts, but they mixed in their feelings. Now, that's not honest reporting. That's the problem with many journalists today, and that was the problem with these spies back then. So the mistake wasn't really so much on the report. The mistake was on their conclusions. Had they stuck to the script and they just related what they saw, right? That's fine. We went, we saw giants, we saw big fruit, we saw fortified cities, we saw whatever, this, that, the other. That's all good. You're giving honest reporting. But once you add in, it's impossible for us to conquer. Was that part of the report? Is that what you were asked to report? That's your conclusion. You're exchanging how you're going to do it as if you can even do it. If they reported just without the conclusion, I'm sure Moshe Rabbeinu would have thanked them, and they would have developed a nice, good military strategy, as IDF is good at doing, based on the reports, based on the Shin Bet, the Mossad, all the different espionage, teams, and they would have come up with a good solution. But that's not what happened. If you read the verse, right? We read that the spies didn't just give the report and go ahead and let's have a braai and we'll figure it out and we'll go. Or maybe we have to delay it a couple of days just to strategize. But they qualified their findings. They explained to the Jews what their discoveries meant. We're unable to go up against these people. It's impossible. They're stronger than us. They didn't just give a report. They were talking heads on all the, on SABC. They were giving their expert opinions. That was the error. No one asked them to say that. That was not their job description. And this is what the problem was. They were limiting God's power. God said, I'll take you to the land flowing with milk and honey. If God was able to split the sea, why are you questioning God's ability to bring you into the land of Israel, which indeed has these features? And ultimately, that's slandering Hashem himself. But we wonder, how did this happen? How is it possible for these great men, read in the Parsha, they were called Anashim, they were men of great stature. How did they make such a shocking mistake? What led them to reach such egregious conclusion? If these people were handpicked by Moshe Rabbeinu himself to carry out such an important task of scouting out the land, they certainly were not simple, ordinary men. They were representatives of the entire nation. They were towering figures. They were righteous, noble giants. So what in the world happened? How did they mess up? And of course, we could ask ourselves, how does it happen that we sometimes mess up in life, right? And this is where we have to go back to that idea that I said at the beginning of our self-definition, of our identity. Whether it's, Rosalind puts it as egotism, which certainly could be part of it, or the way we see ourselves is often the key that opens the door to our success and to our failures. That word "but" can be disastrous. And so when they said that they saw the giants, indeed, but when they described that we were grasshoppers in their eyes, what on earth? How do you know what you are in someone else's eyes? Right? One thing it's one level of projection to say how we were grasshoppers in their eyes. But how we felt like grasshoppers. But to say that in their eyes, how do you know what you are in someone else's eyes? So not only did they see themselves as grasshoppers, but they read other people's minds. Why did they even add that to their report, to their account? What is this, a group therapy? Telling everybody what they were perceived as? And do you ever feel the same yourself? Do you ever feel that you are, intimidated in a certain situation? And I was reading some commentaries. Share with you one of them, which is the Netziv. The Netziv is Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was he was a great rabbi in Russia and then later on in Germany, and he gave a very interesting interpretation that I want to read to you. He says as follows: what does it mean by "Venehi be'einenu kechagavim"? In our eyes, we seem like grasshoppers. So he explains, our hearts fell in fear. We took this as a sign that we will not succeed. Something similar is written actually regarding Shaul HaMelech, King Saul. It says by him, Vayar Shaul esmachen Plishtim, and Saul saw the camp of the Philistines. Right, that's where the name Palestinian comes from. Vayar vayecharad libamad. When he saw this, he feared and his heart trembled greatly. Pirush ayidei shenaf amar beliba. What does this mean? Why does he say that he feared and his heart trembled? What's this double expression? It seems redundant. So therefore, he explains because fear fell into his heart, that's why he was afraid. The fear was itself a sign that he would meet his downfall. The fact that he was fearful already meant that he won't succeed in his mission. Understand this idea? So this is what Rabbi Berlin is explaining. What does it mean in our eyes we seemed like grasshoppers? They were telling the people that we were scared. The spies saw the height and strength of the giants and they became petrified. They were afraid. They saw themselves as meek compared to an enemy. And so they dreaded, what's going to happen? We're going to lose thousands of our people. And the Sfas Emes, another great Hasidic master, he says that's a very, he adds a very important element, a nugget on this topic of self-analysis. He says that that's how they felt. If you go a little bit deeper, he says, in our eyes, we seemed like grasshoppers. That's what led them to feel this way, he says. If you feel like a grasshopper, if you feel like nothing, of course you're going to fear. So this is what they call in modern psychology projection. The spies suffered from low self-esteem. They had a lack of self-esteem. That's what it was, okay? And this is a big problem because this is something that we could face as well, where people often project their self-concept, their self-image on others. Now, this is sometimes the opposite of ego. So there's two sides to the coin. And their lack of self-esteem, and possibly, by the way, it could be that this causes egocentrism sometimes. Because sometimes the people who are so egocentric that it's really a counter balance, so to say, of their lack of self-confidence. So if you look at their wording, it presents their low self-image, that lack of self-esteem and self-confidence. You see, self-image is the picture that we have of ourselves in our head, right? What do we perceive ourselves as? I'm 18, I'm a rabbi, right? People like me, people don't like me. And I start thinking, that's my self-image speaking. Then, my self-image is just my depiction of who I am, right? Okay. Then my self-esteem would be whether people like me or not, right? Or I think I'm a failure. I just don't get it right. Or I'm so ashamed. Or I feel really good about myself, right? Those are self-esteem thoughts. And in fact, psychologists talk about this. When I do a quick Google search, comes up in the self-esteem, the self-concept is what we think about the self. Self-esteem is the positive or negative evaluations about ourselves, okay? So the thing is, self-confidence actually is a positive feeling because you feel good about yourself. You're happy, you're proud. And we think that we're able to accomplish, we're able to achieve the tasks we set ourselves out to do. And people with a healthy self-confidence, and sometimes ego is a good thing, by the way. Sometimes it's good. You need to have a healthy ego in life. Healthy ego. I'm not saying that all ego is good, but a healthy ego, where you have a healthy self-esteem, that's very good. And people with that healthy self-confidence will actually be confident and happy, and that they'll be contributing members to society because they recognize, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a mom, I'm a dad, I'm a rabbi, I'm whatever I am. And if you have a healthy self-confidence, you're able to achieve your goals because you know who you are, you know what you do. That's your self-confidence speaking. And that's very good. Somebody with a negative self-image is going to assume that others have a negative view of them. And that's where the low self-esteem comes from, right? When someone doesn't think that they're worthy, when I think I'm just a bad person, I'm not a good rabbi, I'm a failure, I messed up, then all of a sudden I start thinking what you're all thinking about. I don't know what you think about me unless you tell me. But if I'm in that negative space, all of a sudden I start thinking what you're thinking about me. And that's what happened to the spies. They suffered from these problems. They suffered, as the Sfas Emes teaches us, that first they saw themselves as small, as meek, as little insects compared to the giant Canaanites. It's a negative self-image. And that, of course, breeds a negative self-esteem. And then they assumed that the giants saw them that way. That's projection. You don't know what someone else is thinking. I don't want to say this publicly, but they say if you take apart the word assume, you're making something, the first three letters of the word, out of you and me. Okay? So that's the problem when we assume. And that led to their fear. That led to their doubt if they could be successful in this war against them. It was a lack of self-confidence. There's no way we could succeed at this if we're so meek and we're so weak, right? So the question is, though, why did these men, right? We asked before, these were great men. So why did they see themselves this way? Right? An average person, I understand, you're scared, you're confronting terrifying giants. But these weren't average individuals. The Torah calls them leaders of the people. Rashi says these were very important diplomats. They were worthy of the job. So what happened? If they're worthy of the job, how did these great people of stature fall into the abyss of negative projection, of unhealthy self-esteem? How does it happen? So that's the challenge we face. And we sometimes also in life, sometimes we think that it's part of humility having a low self-esteem. And that's what I want to share with you today, the difference between humility, being humble, and a low self-esteem, which is not good. Obviously, the opposite, arrogance, is a terrible thing, right? You mentioned ego. Ego is easing God out, right? It's three letters. Because obviously, when you talk about somebody who's righteous and pious, you want to steer clear of any negative traits. The problem is you have to have a balance. Can't go too far. To quote my mother of blessed memory, anything that's extreme is no good. Everything has to be in moderation, including moderation. So let's try to understand what the spies were trying to achieve. What was their humility all about? Because if they lacked in their self-esteem and self-confidence, and as the commentaries tell us, they were very humble, they were great people. And greatness requires humility. In describing Moshe Rabbeinu in last week's parsha, the Torah says, "V'ha'ish Moshe anav mikol adam." Moshe was the most humble of all people. Yet Moshe still was the greatest leader in all of our history. So where did they go wrong if they were trying to be humble? And that's an important aspect in our own life. Because yes, arrogance is wrong, but humility also has to be kept in check. And obviously, it's no secret that the Torah is opposed to any forms of arrogance. In the Talmud, it says that any person who's arrogant, what's the words? Ani v'hu einan yechelim ladr ba'olam. He and I cannot live in the world together. It's just impossible. Gangsters, the gangsters, two of us ain't going to be in this space together. God says a person who is arrogant God has utter disdain for arrogance. Okay? So it makes sense that the spies wanted to stay far away from arrogance. So what's the opposite of arrogance? Where would they go? Go the other way. What's the other way? Be humble, right? So the virtue of humility, and in fact, Chassidus talks a lot about this concept called bittul. And bittul is an important part of life. And in fact, when you study Chassidic teachings, which Chabad is all about, Chabad is a philosophy, there's a tremendous encouragement and promotion of that people should have bittul, certain bittul, qualities of humility. And literally, bittul is not just humility. It's about negating the ego. It's self-effacement, okay? And Chassidus sees that this concept of self-nullification, of a little bit of feeling insignificant, right? How perhaps I'm unworthy in this world. But you can't take it too far away. Again, we need to have a balance. On the one hand, there's what's called yeshus. Yeshus is ego. As Rosalind, you said, ego, no good. There's gaiva, arrogance. And we're told that is a source of negativity in life. So we have to find that balance. On the one hand, ego, arrogance, no good. We have to negate that. So how are we supposed to do that? What are we supposed to do about it? Right? What's the way? Does God want us to have a robust skyscraper-sized self-esteem? Or are we supposed to be very humble? Where are we supposed to find? Obviously, we know we have to find something in the middle, because all extremes are no good. Nullifying ourselves, on the one hand, it's meant to, subdue any arrogance or pride. Okay? If I think I'm the best parent or rabbi or dad or whatever in the world, then I think it's going to lead me in the wrong direction. On the other hand, you did well, you achieved something, you gave a good shiur, you inspired people, you helped some people out in business, you closed a good deal, right? Should you not feel good about it? Well, you're not a millionaire yet. So you have to find the balance. On the one hand, feel good. I'm going to learn from my successes. On the other hand, you haven't achieved the greatest success yet, right? If I say I'm nothing, my accomplishments are worthless, I'm doing the opposite. I am now saying, I'm no good. Even when I am good, I'm no good. And that's the problem with the spies, according to the Hasidic approach to this, that they belittle themselves the moment the challenge presented itself to them. So certainly God doesn't expect that we should never feel good or not good about ourselves, right? We're human beings. So we have to really get a better understanding of the soul. A healthy self-esteem is essential to our mental, our emotional health, our well-being. A psychiatrist once said, the overwhelming number of psychological or emotional problems which exist could be traced back to a lack of self-esteem. That's the problem that we find in the world. So as one of my teachers used to say, our generation doesn't suffer from arrogance. Our generation suffers from low self-esteem. Whatever the case is, we know that you need to find the balance between the two. We can't have the extreme. Now, we know that the Torah's ways are drachea darchinam, are pleasant and peaceful. So Certainly, the Torah wouldn't demand that a person should have a unhealthy self-esteem. And we have to understand then what's this idea of bittul? What's the concept that we're being encouraged to have humility? Is it humility, arrogance? What's going on? So let's cut to the bottom of it. Humility and bittul are not the same, okay? The traditional concept of humility, okay, of anava, as it's called, Moshe Rabbeinu's anav, is about knowing our limits. We have to be cognizant. We have to be aware of our weaknesses, of our shortcomings. That is important. Not saying that you have to constantly be advertising them, but if we're aware of them, we can overcome them. Chassidus takes us a step further and says there's a concept of bittul, which is that we should see ourselves, we should never see ourselves as independent of God. Now, let's use Jack as an example. Jack worked hard to rise in the ranks of his business, of his company. And he's very proud of his exceptional skills, of his intricate knowledge of everything in this field. Right? So he works across the road at NetBank, and he's really good at what he does. And he sees that his traits of his business acumen that makes him successful. Now, if Jack is humble in the way that we defined it, right? He tells himself, I'm a great people's person, but I'm horrendous at putting together a productive schedule. I know a lot about investments. He's honest with his skill sets, but at the same time, he says that he's also aware of his shortcomings. So you understand, that is dealing, here we're talking about, here you have a good sense, before we get into the concept of bittul, self-negation. He is a humble person, right? He understands what he's good at, and he understands his struggles, okay? So it's good. We recognize our limits, and we know where we have to delegate our time, our energy, our resources, whatever it might be. Right? If he, for example, realizes that he's not good with his time, then he can hire a secretary to take care of that aspect and do whatever it takes. But if he was arrogant, he would say, I could do it all myself. Now, so a humble person recognizes their strengths, their skills, their talents, their shortcomings, and they're able to remain humble as long as it doesn't get into the head. Okay, and that's a good thing. We're certainly promoting that. Now, an even humbler person is not going to take credit for the success. Is not going to see that I'm the greatest investment banker, blah, 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 right? Because they're going to say, it's a gift from God. Maybe had someone else been afforded my talents, maybe they would have even done better than I would in this position. Now that's really getting even humbler. But still, even healthy humility is not the same as what Chassidus encourages, the idea of bittul. Because bittul, which means self-nullification, is different. It doesn't focus on my positive and negative traits, but it goes to the very sense of self. It's telling me that everything I do is credited to Hashem. It's not me. Thank God for everything I have. So now the question is, is bittul about losing my entire self, completely, losing my identity? That can't be a good thing. Is the Torah demanding that I should be self-loathing? So what's this all about? So we explained already, ego and arrogance is no good, and we're trying to have a healthy humility. But now we're trying to understand this concept of bittul. So let me explain to you. Bittul, you would think I'm inside of the pot, in the cholent, I'm mixed in there, I'm like nothing else, everything's God. Well, that's true. But let's try to understand it. Bittul does not mean I'm meaningless, okay? Let's explain. People often misinterpret the concept of bittul, that I'm insignificant, because the ego is evil. We have to completely obliterate my ego. End of story. But that's not the case. Chassidus understands bittul as a means to an end. It's a method of turning our focus onto something beyond the ego. Okay? We're not breaking the ego. We're going beyond it. We could still recognize our talents and abilities, but take it a step further. So therefore, I want to go into Shulchan Aruch for a moment. And in Shulchan Aruch, there's a law that's taught that if a forbidden food falls into, say, this pot right here, okay? Good example. If some milk fell into our meat stew in front of us right here, yes, you have a nice, good, delicious meat stew, okay? Now some milk fell in. What do we do? Okay? Now you could say that one option is give it to a Gentile to taste it. If they say that there's no taste of milk in it, okay, then that's one option that's mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. Another option is, what if there's no Gentile around, right? What do you do then? Well, then we have to measure how much more meat is there than milk in this pot, okay? So if there is, what is it called? Bitul b'shishim. If there's 60 times more meat than milk, okay, then it's okay and you could still eat it. Now, how do you know? Hopefully there's a way for you to measure. If you know it's just a little bit of milk, you know it's a lot more than 60 times more. So let's just analyze this case. What happened here? A piece, let me go into the law itself, okay? Because something fell into the pot, and halacha says that if there's 60 times more kosher meat than the milk, then it's kosher, right? Even though you can't mix milk and meat according to Jewish law, can't cook them together. But if 60 times more one quantity than the other, then it's not considered cooked together. Now we have to understand that if the milk, let's say it was cheese, if it's recognizable, then you're going to have to remove it, okay? You can't let it sit there. But if it was milk, it's probably not recognizable. It's probably submerged and mixed in, okay? Now, it's dissolved in there. So according to the law, it's called batel b'shish. You understand why I'm mentioning this? Because batel means it's nullified. It's absorbed within the kosher, within the rest of the meat, within the rest of the stew. So, so let's try to understand this term batel, which means nullified, in the context of the halacha of milk and meat, or any other substance that wasn't kosher falling into a kosher pot, and then we could apply it to our own self-image. So if there's exactly 60, let's say, ounces of meat in the pot that the milk fell into, is the dish kosher? Of course, right? It's still kosher. Let's into this. Listen, fascinating what the halacha says. According to Jewish law, it's now not looked at as 60 ounces of kosher food plus 1 ounce of milk, which otherwise wouldn't be kosher if we didn't have the 60 above it. But rather now we see it as 61 ounces of meat stew. And so, if by mistake, not intentionally, but if by mistake, another ounce of milk or of pork or whatever it was that fell into this pot now, 1 ounce against 61. Do we say it's not going to be kosher because we have only 60 ounces of meat against 1 ounce of milk, and now another ounce, it's not kosher? Separate, remember, separate ounce of milk. No. The law, in fact, is that this has now become submerged. It's batel. It's nullified. It's become part of the meat stew. And therefore, you now have 61 times whatever else comes in. Now, isn't this a fascinating idea? It's not only become nullified, and it's transformed. It's become batel. It's no longer milk. It now became part of the meat stew. It has a whole new existence. You understand? That's bittul. We're going to have to understand how that applies to ourselves. That you become batel to Hashem, and we reach a higher level where we become one with God. Let me give you another example that comes to mind. When it comes to the laws of Shabbos, okay? You know you're not allowed to carry in the streets on Shabbos, right? Now, what do we do here in Joburg? We have an Eruv, which allows us to carry here. The concept of an Eruv is that we incorporate certain areas. The highway can't be included because the highway is always a public domain. But certain areas which don't have a lot of foot traffic, they could be included in an area that we are allowed to carry by incorporating it in and making it a privatized area. See here, now, like all the other Lamed Tes Malachas, the 39 forms of work that are forbidden, that are prohibited on Shabbos, only a certain definition of labor is prohibited, right? So yesterday we said it's only if you dig the hole for the purpose of a hole, not for the purpose of the soil that you want from it. And the same thing is, to be liable for carrying on Shabbos, a person needs to transport something of value. The definition of value, of course, changes from item to item. What makes the item valuable? I assume a diamond would be valuable regardless of the size, right? What about a pebble? Is a pebble valuable? I don't know. So what would we say about somebody who carries a very small amount of food, less than the amount that's necessary, that you could say is valuable? Would it say that since it's valuable to the carrier, maybe, so therefore the person should be liable? Or do we say that the object he's carrying is not valuable to him and therefore he's not liable? And the halacha discusses this. Let me just share with you what the Rambam says. He tells us a person who transfers less than the standard measure of a substance is not liable, even if he transfers it in a container. The reason is because the container is a subsidiary to the contents. So when the person who transfers it, he's concerned not with the container, but with what's in it. So he's not liable, he's saying, because if there's very little inside the container. And are you carrying it for the container or for the food? Now, it doesn't change the fact that the bowl, the container might be valuable, right? And you carried something, but it's an empty bowl. An empty bowl is not really of value to anybody. But because in this instance, he's carrying a bowl with food inside it, and it's so little food, so it doesn't make sense that he has any purpose for it. So despite the fact that the bowl itself has value, but the minimal food that's inside it is not so valuable, here what do we see? It's a concept that's called bittul. The bowl is bottled to the food. It's nullified to the food. And bittul doesn't just mean to disappear, to be meaningless. It's about service, transformation. So, what is its purpose? That's bittul. How does this apply to ourselves? Right? The question Bittul asks us is, how do you define yourself? How do you define yourself? Bittul goes beyond particular traits. It cuts to the heart of human identity. Bittul doesn't want us to just become nothing, insignificant for no reason. It demands that we become subsumed in something higher. That's the idea. And so, if we talked about self-image, I think there are many layers of our personalities, right? We all wear many hats, and we could choose to identify with any number of them, right? People see themselves by their profession. I'm a rabbi, right? I'm an American, South African, right? So we could see ourselves by my profession, my patriotism, or I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son, I'm a brother. What else? I can also define myself by my behavior. I'm a bad person. I'm no good. I failed. I messed up. Then we start judging ourselves. Or of course, we could do so positively, right? We could talk about I'm valuable. I make a big difference. I have 5,000 Facebook friends. So all of these images that we think of ourselves, whether they're noble or they're vain, whatever, that could often be the cause of confusion, of frustration. And this is especially true when people see themselves as failing in any areas of life, because they are overly identifying with that particular facet. Remember, we've said many times, just because I failed doesn't mean I'm a failure. Don't confuse the two. Getting knocked down is not a failure. Staying down, yes, that. If someone sees social acceptance in a certain group as of importance to them, I've seen this. I was at a retirement home the other day and somebody was complaining to me about the cliques and all that. I said, start your own clique, easier said than done. But the point is, that's where if our identity, whether I'm accepted or not by someone else, becomes that factor, then I think we're in dangerous waters. Okay? So that's the thing. Let's all ask ourselves, on the deepest level, do I believe that my worth is conditional in anything? Haven't we said enough times in our shiurim here that we are all indispensable to God? The fact that God put us in this world means we matter. I am because God made me. And the mere fact that God created me means that's enough of a reason why I matter in this world, right? God chose me. And perhaps that's what we say in Moda'ani every morning. Bechemla Rabba Amunasecha. We are grateful to God because God chose me. Yes, God chose me again this morning. I wasn't on the Chev website. Right? I'm not dead. No funeral. Thank God. I'm here. God chose me for another day to make a difference in this world. So it's not about who likes me or what I've earned or how we look. Yes, I know those play a factor. But the fact is I'm God's creation. And that alone defines me, and that alone should direct me. Bittul, in its deepest sense, means that I truly identify as godly. I realize God put me in this world, and therefore my question is, what does God want from me today? That's the question. And that's the idea that Hasidus introduces. So it's good to be humble. It's good to have humility. But Bittul is taking it a step further. I am one with Hashem. Not only am I God's creation, but godliness is who I am. Godliness is the true, authentic me. That's my real self, because I am a part of God. We've said many times, each one of us, our soul is a piece of God. And if that's the case, if we realize that at our core, we're each a part of God, and that's bittul. That's the sense when we really know who we are. And then we're at peace, then we know our place in this world and the direction that we take. But unfortunately, there are often layers that mask our true self. And that's what confuses us and misdirects us. And that's what we constantly need to remind ourselves. That's the idea of bittul. And this was a major mistake of the spies in our parsha. If we think about in life, when we have our shortcomings or our failures or we messed up on something, okay, that happened. If I put them in the context of bittul, I realize it's all part of a divine plan, that sometimes things won't work out the way I or my ego wants it to work out. But I realize, if I realize it's part of the divine plan, then on the contrary, I think I'm empowered. I think that there's a greater purpose lying ahead. And even my failings are part of the plan. So we have to get in touch with that godly aspect. And yes, we said this world is God's garden, right? In the garden, sometimes there's rubble and sometimes there's weeds. We have to cut through those elements in our life. So we should never think that we're insignificant. We just have to realize that yes, sometimes we might face these obstacles and challenges and struggles. And how am I going to overcome them? It's part of the divine plan. Ebbing, easing God out. But the more I negate that shallow self, the ego, the more my divine self is going to shine. And so let's realize it's not an all or nothing proposition, of course. And that's why bittul is an idea we try to implement in our lives however we can. We discussed the idea a few weeks ago, the concept of the husk, the klipa, that sometimes we have to peel off the layers to reveal that shining soul inside each of us. And so if we realize that aspect, if we realize that, sometimes I'll have my struggles, my challenges, my difficulties, but I'll overcome them. And I realize if it's part of a divine plan, then it will come to shine in my life. And so I think this is a powerful aspect. If we can work on the bittul, realize that whatever happens, it's all part of the divine plan. It's all despite the pitfalls, the obstacles, part of it. So don't get caught up in self-berating. Don't beat yourself up if something didn't work out as planned. Realize, no, it's part of the plan. So we have to conclude, but we're not done yet. I still have a few more points I want to express. I'm going to go a little bit over time today. So here's the $1 million question. How do we stay safe in this self-nullification process? Okay, we learned the idea of bittul, and we have to negate that ego. We have to realize we're part of Hashem's master plan in this world. So how do we do this, right? If I'm stuck in a position where life is not so leka, how am I going to move into the better place? So let's go back into the parsha, and we'll conclude with the lesson that we learned. We realize that true bittul is only when we recognize the reason and the destination of anything that happens is part of the divine plan. It means I have a strong belief in God. And when somebody believes that it's not about, squashing my self-identity, that's a mistake. Don't dismiss your self-worth. That was the error of the spies. They knew how negative arrogance was, so they went to the opposite extreme. It sounds good intentions, right? But they misunderstood the concept of what bittul is. They thought it meant destroying their ego, right? Destroying any sense of self-image and self-esteem, because their self-negation didn't bring them to a true self-discovery. That's not bittul. Bittul is not destroying myself, I'm worthless. Bittul is recognizing I am. God gave me these talents. God gave me these abilities. How am I going to use them well? So what would a successful spy look like? How should they have behaved, right? What would have been the better way for them to have behaved? Had the spies practiced bittul properly, they would have gotten in touch with their mission, right? They're emissaries of God. The fact that Moshe put them into this position means they are capable. Nothing's impossible. I'm possible, right? The very word itself says it. So it's not about beating themselves up for their shortcomings. It's not about saying that they can't achieve this. You can't be so humble. Somebody said, don't be so humble, you're not so great. So we have to prepare ourselves mentally and physically every day, before davening, right? And we have to think before we daven. In fact, it says in Shulchan Aruch that before you pray, a person should realize how great God is and how low we are. We have to remove all of our ego from our heart. What does this mean practically? Do we have to, again, belittle ourselves? And the truth is, in order to be humble, we need to have some ego. Think about the greatness of God, and will bring us an appreciation of God, why God put me in this world. And then I realize that it's not an arrogance if I realize God put me here and God gave me these specific skill sets and talents and abilities that only nobody else in this world can do what I can do. I'm indispensable to God's plan. And this is what we're meant to meditate before we daven. First, we have to contemplate on the greatness of God, right? It starts with God. We have to remind ourselves that we have an intrinsic bond with God, And we are God's messengers on this planet. And what our purpose is, why did God put me here? There's something only I can do and nobody else could do. And maybe that's why God put me and not anybody else in this particular position. That's what we have to try to meditate and think about. And if we could think about that before we pray, because we're realizing how great God is, and God wouldn't make a mistake. God put me in this world. It means nobody else could fulfill this position. But to do so with that sense of humility. So to conclude, my friends, in today's world, where so much of our lives are on display with all the social media and everything else, it becomes so easy to identify with, to define ourselves by our achievements, by external factors, by what other people might be judging us for. But if we want to lead a harmonious and wholesome life, then we have to reassess ourselves. The story of the spies highlights the way we have to see ourselves as God's emissaries, that we have tremendous power and potential, that's why we are here. And when we focus on godliness and spirituality and our divine self, on the mission that God put us in this world for, then we're not going to fall into those, in the pitfalls of low self-esteem, of a misguided version of insignificance. But rather, we'll see ourselves as that indispensable soul that God put in this world, because nobody else could do what we could do. And therefore, I think our task is focus on the positive. You are fantastic. The fact that God put you here means you have a mission to achieve, you have a mission to accomplish, and only you can do it. And therefore, be proud of that in a healthy, happy, and proud way. But realize, where does that talent come from? It comes from the one who gave it to me, the Almighty above. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, thank you all. Have a great day. See you, please, God, tomorrow. I'm hoping for tomorrow's shiur to talk about the journey of the two spies, Yehoshua and Caleb. They went to pray at the resting places of the righteous in Hebron. And I want to look at history and different aspects of where this comes from, why we pray at the graves of the righteous. I think it's a question a lot of people wonder about. For example, Miron, right? What happened in that tragedy where there were over 100,000 people at the gravesite of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Lag BaOmer? On the Rebbe's yahrzeit, not just on the Rebbe's yahrzeit, I should say every single day, there are thousands of people literally who come to pay respects, to pray at the Rebbe's gravesite. And there are there are many great leaders who are interred in Europe and other places, and even here. And what is it? Why do we pray at the graves of righteous people? Please, God, that will be tomorrow's shiur. And looking forward to exploring that with you here together tomorrow. Same place, same time. See you then. Thank you.
Thank you.